Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts, Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, Jim Seibert, and Barry Harrison, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, this is Barry with ABC Trucking. How may I help you?
Barry, this is Mike Bohan, and I hate to call you on this, but man, I just been involved in an accident.
Oh my! All right. Well, Mike, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm sitting here on the side of the road, and I don't really know what's going on yet.
Okay. Did you sustain any injuries? Do you feel hurt or anything? Are you in shock?
No, I'm fine.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in pursuit of safety. Today, we're going to discuss what we do when we get the call and a driver has been involved in an accident. Guys, I think everyone on this podcast has probably at some time or another received that phone call. Today, the whole point of this episode is to try to prepare those who may have not or may have become so accustomed to getting it that it becomes a bit of a blind spot. And we talk about blind spots all the time on this podcast. So really, I just kind of want to open it up to the group, because I think all of us have been involved in these situations, and, really drive home just how important it is to be prepared before this takes place, so that and that you can train your people to be prepared when you get that call. So really, I just want to open it up to the floor and just ask you guys, what did it look like when you got the call? What were the things that you were focused on procedurally to make sure that you remained in compliance? And even after the fact, the follow-up counseling and coaching that may take place after those accidents occur. So with that, gentlemen, let's get started.
Barry, and I have received many of those phone calls as a former safety director, and they're never, ever pleasant. Even if you're dealing with nothing other than property damage, they're not pleasant. But I want to kind of give a little structural framework for the rest of our discussion, and then have you guys kind of flesh this skeleton out and put some meat on the bones. But we literally could talk about this topic for multiple episodes of Driving the Line. But for the sake of this episode, I think we have to at least consider regulatory requirements. What does the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations say if you're involved in a crash? What are some pragmatic things that a company needs to think about if they're involved in a crash? What are things drivers need to think about if they're involved in a crash? And what about the residual consequences that take place later on, depending on the severity of the crash? And we're getting today in our society, with as much litigation going on, it doesn't even have to anymore be a real serious crash where you'd end up with some of those residual consequences that are down the way. So let's talk first, because I know we have a lot of safety directors that listen to the podcast. And safety directors need to realize that even though they're going to be juggling a whole lot of different balls, have a bunch of things in the air at one time while they're dealing with a crash, they need to realize the moment that crash occurred, if it meets the DOT definition of what an accident is, and DOT still uses that term accident. Most of the states now have gone to using the term crash. You get a crash report, but FMCSA still defines these incidents we're talking about as accidents. But if that happens, a clock starts ticking, particularly if it's going to require post-accident alcohol and drug testing. And that clock starts ticking no matter what else is going on. And y'all know I'm down in Texas, and you get to the western part of my state, and it is an enormous chunk of geography. With huge patches of open land between any recognizable towns. and you get out on Interstate 10 west of Midland, Odessa, and heaven forbid a truck's involved in an accident out there, and the highway patrol takes them an hour to get there because they're that far away. And you know, the driver, you feel like you're going to need to do alcohol and drug testing on your driver, and that clock's been ticking from the time that crash occurred, and yet you know you're hours away from the source of getting that testing done. So my point about that is we definitely have to look at regulatory requirements, and then we need to think about, well, what is it the company needs to do? What kind of policies, procedures, what do they need to do in terms of training for their drivers? When that driver calls in, and Mike represented himself as a driver calling you and saying, I've had a crash, and you did the right thing, Barry, by very first asking him, are you hurt? Are you injured? Demonstrate care for your driver first. But then what do you tell that driver? I mean, once you figure out he or she is not injured and that they are your boots on the ground at that scene, what is that safety director going to tell that driver to do at the scene right then? And because a lot of things that driver does are critically important if we ever move into that last phase that I shared about the potential consequences later, primarily being litigation. So first of all, and Mike, anything you want to add here, let's talk a little bit from a regulatory perspective. First of all, what does DOT define as a commercial motor vehicle accident? Well, it has to be a commercial motor vehicle operating on a public highway. And then it's involved in an incident that results in one of three things. It's either a fatality, some person is killed, and it has to be a human being, not a fatality of an animal. Okay, in case a truck hits a deer or a cow or whatever. It's got to be a human fatality. Or you have a vehicle that is so heavily damaged due to disabling damage that it has to be towed away from the scene, or someone is injured to the point that they require treatment away from the scene. So if any of those three things happen, we have a fatality, we have injuries requiring treatment away from the scene, or we have a vehicle that has to be towed due to disabling damage, it then meets the definition of a DOT accident. So one thing absolutely is going to happen at that point is it's going to go on our accident register, which we're required to keep for 3 years. That's something, though, that's fixable afterwards. But the thing that's most difficult for safety directors to understand and oftentimes to comply with, depending on where these crashes occur, is the post-accident alcohol and drug testing out of Part 382 of the regs. And so the very first thing that has to happen is you must first have a DOT recordable crash, which again is the fatality, injuries requiring treatment away from the scene, or vehicle being towed due to disabling damage. Then, if it's a fatality, we always have to test our driver, no matter what, no matter who's killed, unless it's our driver who died. But if there's a fatality involved, no matter whose fault it is, we have to test our driver. The other two instances is where it gets a little murky. If you have injuries requiring treatment away from the scene, or you have a vehicle towed to disabling damage, then your driver must also receive a citation, a ticket, in relationship to a moving violation related to the crash. If that occurs, then you have to test your driver. So let's say that a crash has occurred, it meets the criteria, and we have to test our driver. And I preface this by saying a clock started ticking. The clock started ticking because we have to get that alcohol test within 8 hours. Technically, we have to get that test within 2 hours. That's almost always impossible to do in a truck crash because the driver's just going to be at the scene that long. But if you don't get him tested, he or she, within 2 hours, you have to put a note in the file why you didn't. But then you got 8 hours to finally obtain that test. If you don't obtain the alcohol test within 8 hours, again, you must put a note in the file. And at that point, you cease trying to get the alcohol test, okay? A drug test, a little more liberal because the drugs will stay in the system longer. We have up to 32 hours to obtain a drug test. But the important thing to remember is no matter what else you're doing in terms of company policies, procedures, all those balls that a safety director is juggling, don't ever forget that running alongside everything are the regulatory requirements. And the reason I stress those, and I'm going to punt and let Mike add anything he wants to this, is because if it ever ends up in litigation, okay, and you didn't do the things you're required to do by law, the regulatory functions An attorney, and he or she doesn't even have to be a really, really good attorney. They're going to make you look terrible in front of a jury because they're basically going to say, ladies and gentlemen, after this person ran over my client, they didn't do what they were required to do by the law either. So it's just important not to forget those regulatory requirements in addition to all the other things that you've got going on.
100%, Kenny. I agree. This is the baseline when we're looking at what we do post accident. There's requirements that we have to follow from the regulations, and you hit on them all. I'm going to just sum those up really quick because you did a great job of giving us a lot of detail there. The first thing you guys want to do, look at the definition of what a crash is, what an accident is. You'll find that in 390.5. Kenny laid it out. It's that fatality, injury, tow away. 390.5, look at those definitions, look at accident. It'll show you that. Once you figure out that you've got that DOT recordable accident, then you go into Part 382 and that post-accident, and that's in 382, 303. Guys, there's a really nice chart right there in 382, 303 that shows exactly what Kenny just said. It outlines it very well. You can go back and listen to this again, listen to Kenny's words again about when to test, when not to test, things like that. But go to 382.303. There's a table in there that's a really good chart. I know a lot of people that they'll photocopy that, they'll blow it up, and they'll put it right on the bulletin board right at their desk, because in the heat of the moment, if you're not dealing with that stuff every day, it may be hard to remember. Do I not test? Is the clock running on me on this one? You've got a real nice reference chart right there that you can just post. It's a great thing to look at. So I can't stress enough just exactly what Kenny just said as far as the regulatory requirements, and not only understanding those, but really following through with those, because once that DOT recordable accident happens, as Kenny said, the clock has started. We've got some requirements that we need to follow through with, potentially with that drug and alcohol testing. And that starts from the time of the accident, and it's a challenge at sometimes. Kenny, you mentioned Western Texas, but we've got places all over this country that are rural, that are, sometimes they happen late at night or in the overnight hours, things like that. It's a challenge. And most of the time when I get calls from our clients on things like this, that's the challenge: is where do we go? Where do we send them? What do? We know the clock is running, but we can't get them in somewhere. That's something that you need to be aware of. The different geographic locations. If you're using a third party that's doing your drug and alcohol testing for you, they should be able to help you with that stuff. There should be a network of places you can send them, but there's not much more we can say about the importance of that regulatory part. But as Kenny laid this out, you were laying out the structure of this podcast. Kenny, you were talking about the first thing we want to talk about is those DOT recordable accidents, the regulatory requirements. But what about those accidents that are non-DOT? They don't fall under the guidelines of, the definition of 390.5, what an accident is. What about those? What's the company doing? How are we handling those? We get that call like Barry did at the beginning of this podcast. You get a driver that says, just had an accident, and it's not a fatality. It's not a tow away. It's not an injury, but we still bumped into another car. There's another party involved. What's the conversation like then? What's that driver going to do then? And I'm going to throw that question out to the rest of the crew, because I know a couple of you guys have had those calls come in your previous lives as safety directors. What's that conversation look like, and how are we walking those drivers through what they should be doing, even though it may not meet the definition of a DOT recordable accident? Because Kenny, as you said, this is a sue happy world. And we see it every day where, companies that they're getting involved in what I would consider minor accidents, but litigation still comes about of those. So how are we having that conversation with that driver when it's a non-DOT accident?
And Mike, you mentioned about that a lot of safety directors have taken that chart out of 382 and they post it on the wall right by their desk. I would encourage safety directors to do the very same thing with an accident checklist.
Absolutely.
Decide what y'all's internal protocol is, whatever that is. And if you don't have one, reach out to one of us. There's some really good ones available on the internet. There's some law firms that have put ones out. That there's some vendors that I won't name names. We're not allowed to do this on here, but one of the largest suppliers of educational material in the trucking industry has a checklist that they put out. Most of the big insurance carriers, and we're an agency, we're a broker, but the insurance carriers themselves, most of them have a checklist. And I would just encourage safety directors, print that thing out, because no matter how sharp you are, no matter how attentive to detail you are, when that call comes in, your mind just starts racing, all the different things and it's like multitasking. And if you've got that chart right there or that checklist right by your desk, you can just simply go down the list and ask the driver, things like, hey, have you secured the vehicle? The driver said, what does that mean? Is the truck drivable? Are you off the highway? Do you have your four-way flashers on? Have you turned every light on that stupid truck on? We want that thing lit up like the Astrodome. Have you put out your triangles? Have you called 911? Have you walked over to the other car and checked on the people? We don't want you admitting fault, but we do want you showing compassion and empathy toward others. Have you taken photos? Do you know what kind of photos we want you to take? Those are the kind of things. And again, we talked about, and Mike and I have already thoroughly discussed the regulatory requirements, but then we talked about what does the company need to do? And that's kind of twofold. What's going on at the terminal? What's going on at the office? What's going on at the mothership, if you will? But don't forget, you've got a driver stuck out there on the side of that highway. And depending on the severity of that crash, he or she may be seeing something they've never seen before. And you're maybe even having to do a little trauma counseling over the phone. But one thing you can do, if you can start giving that driver demonstrable task for he or she to do. Have you taken photos? Have you put out your triangles? Do you have all the lights on that truck? Are your four-way flashers on? All of those sorts of things. You start giving that driver those tasks, but you won't remember those in the heat of the moment if you don't have a checklist there available for you.
Yeah. And Kenny, you're talking about this checklist, and you mentioned the insurance companies. A lot of these insurance companies that are going to be insuring the folks that are listening to us, they have those accident reporting kits. You can put those in a truck. It's like you could have them if you're a safety director, you've got that list at the office, have that out. But those accident reporting kits, a lot of times companies will put those in the truck. So if an accident happens, the driver's got that in their hand. Now you guys are both looking at the same thing. You've got your checklist and the driver's saying, okay, have you done this? Okay, I've got my accident reporting kit here. Yeah, okay, I got my triangles out. Yes, I've checked on the other driver. I called 911. All of that stuff. He's got that checklist or she's got that checklist, and it gives them a little stability there. It gives them something solid to stand on. It gives them something to hold on to. And that safety director's got the same thing. They're looking at the same thing. So we're both on the same page, and we're going down through that checklist, and we're making sure we're giving this, Kenny, just like you said, we're giving this driver exactly the information they need and giving them something to do when they're in a situation that is high stress, to say the least. I mean, it's going to be a high stress situation.
We were talking about those accident kits. All of us on here are old enough to remember when they still had a disposable camera in the kit.
Camera in them. That's right.
Every truck driver now has got a cell phone they use for a camera, but those are the kits we're talking about, are the ones that had the disposable cameras in them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And yeah, you don't see those. If you've got one of those in your trucks, probably need to update your accident reporting a little bit. I'm not calling anybody out or anything, but we've all seen those, but we probably shouldn't see them anymore. Yeah, everybody's got cell phones. And one thing when we're talking about the insurance companies that I will mention here, just kind of as a little side note, is something that you need to have a process for post-accident, is getting this accident reported to your insurance company. That's something that obviously there are steps and there's a process you're going to go through post-accident. But as soon as you absolutely can, whether it's the driver, whether it's the company, whatever your internal process is as a company, it was reporting a claim, that needs to get reported to your insurance company. If it's a serious accident, it's even much more important. If there's injury, if it's one of those DOT recordables that Kenny and I were talking about before, it's a serious accident. There could be somebody injured, could be a fatality, could be a lot of disabling damage to a vehicle. Get that reported as soon as you can to your insurance company, because they may be sending adjusters out to the scene right away. Sometimes those adjusters get there before anybody else does. And as far as outside of law enforcement, So that's an important thing you're going to need to think about. And that needs to be in your process. That needs to be in your checklist of, okay, we've done this, this, and this. Has anybody called, XYZ insurance company and reported this claim, and let them know what's going on? So make sure that that's in your checklist, in your reporting process, because that may be something that is a secondary thought, but in the grand scheme of things, especially if it's a serious accident, this could be a great benefit to you as far as how that accident goes, how that investigation goes. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but that's my mind automatically now goes to we've got the driver at the scene, and we're having them go through their checklist of what they should do roadside. But now there's an investigation that needs to take place in-house for the company, right? As we walk through this process, it's like, okay, we've taken care of the immediate needs. Now we need to start doing our root cause analysis. What caused this? What were the details? Start building our file together, because whoever the safety director is, whoever it is at the company, and your insurance company obviously will have information that will help you with this, but you need to start building your file and doing an investigation about what happened what truly happened in this accident, and what was the root cause. Fault, not at fault, that's a legal term that we don't get into in the safety world. That's lawyers use that term. We're looking for preventability, non-preventability, and those are the things we want to know, right? Those are the things when we look at this driver, it's like, okay, what happened? Could we have done something better here? Did this driver do everything they could have done? That's all things you need to do in your post-crash investigation. And to me, severity really doesn't matter on this. I think a company should handle their post-crash investigation the same way, whether it was a quote minor incident or it was all the way up to a DOT recordable and it was a more serious accident. Follow through with that. It does take time. It takes a little effort in the safety world to do that post-crash investigation, but we need to be looking at these incidents and these crashes and these accidents, whatever word you want to call them. I call them crashes, but like Kenny said, the DOT still calling them accidents. Whatever happens, we need to be following up on that and doing an investigation. And so we're doing our due diligence to know everything we can about this accident, everything we can about this crash, everything we can about this incident, and we're getting better from that.
Yeah, and Mike, the fact that you mentioned, doing the post-accident investigation, one of the things we've always committed to here on Driving the Line is sharing best practices. And one best practice we've started seeing in our industry, and it hadn't been that long ago, this was almost non-existent. But now, many motor carriers, prior to the safety director or whoever's going to be doing that post-accident investigation, they are first contacting their attorney and having the attorney direct that investigation. And by doing that, it makes at least some, if not all, of the findings of that internal investigation privileged, where the attorney can fight to not have to have that released in case of litigation. If you go out and do an investigation not under the direction of an attorney, that is 100% discoverable. It's just simply going to come up. And the reason that should be a concern to you is, what if you do a more in-depth investigation than what the officers did at the scene, and you find things that you want to know so you can prevent it from happening again, but that could potentially be damaging to your own cause if you're sued. And so I would just encourage you, if you have staff counsel on site, or if you're a big enough carrier, you have your own attorney, or you've got one on retainer, call them up and say, hey, we've been involved in a crash and we'd like to look into it. And the attorney will say, I am now directing you. And then that immediately puts it under at least the privilege to where they can fight to keep that out of court. Because one thing we don't ever want to do is find evidence that's damaging to our cause and then try to hide it. You get into this whole idea of spoliation to where you're intentionally hiding or destroying evidence. And that is never, ever good in court, because you're going to have a judge that's going to direct the jury to assume that evidence was there, it was damaging to you, and they're allowed to take that into consideration. So you simply don't want to have that happen. Barry, I know that you, with your psychology background, and you're the one guy on our team that's always been the advocate to be your brother and sister's keeper. If one of our drivers happens to be injured, or heaven forbid killed, And again, we're talking about things the company would need to be doing. We don't ever want to lose sight of the fact that driver's got a life away from this company, and he or she's got a family somewhere. If they're young enough, it may just be his or her parents. If they're married, it may be a spouse and children. But I know, having been a former safety director, we had some drivers involved in some really, really bad crashes, and we ended up having to go as advocates for the family. Now, law enforcement made official notification if there was a death involved, but we would go and actually try to take care or look out for our family. So, again, we're just mentioning things that we need to be aware of as a safety director, as a company. Sometimes the safety director and the company reps get so focused on what they need to be doing at the company, they forget. Even if their driver goes to the hospital, and is not killed, but is going to be admitted to the hospital, is somebody from the company there sitting in the waiting room with that company's family, a terminal manager or somebody else on the staff, another driver that knows this driver. But thinking about, again, and Barry, I love the fact you brought up this whole idea of being our brother and sister's keeper. And I hope we keep weaving that thread through all of our future podcasts anytime we're talking about driver type things. But one other thing, just thinking about the driver's family.
Definitely. And again, it goes back to me while we're being our brother and sister's keeper, that goes so much deeper than just if you see something unsafe, you have the power to stop it. To me, it goes to if you know that one of your fellow drivers, this goes for anyone. If you're sitting in the seat, or if you're a safety professional, a dispatcher, ownership, there should be follow-up calls that take place if you're able to make sure that person is, again, in the right mindset when they're driving, and they're setting the tone and getting their mind on the task at hand. That's the main thing, because even when, looking back on my driving career, if I would have a minor incident, it's kind of like, to compare it to a sport is hard to do, but you've got to, work through what had happened and really get in your own mind and say, where was my mind when that took place? If it's backing into somebody at a truck stop or something like that, you've got to have a humble approach, because we're all professionals and we should want to get better even when these things happen. So you've got to have an honest conversation with your safety director, with your safety manager, whomever it may be, and be proactive in offering, how you could have prevented that. Because with some of the technologies and stuff now, that was one of my favorite things, was to get to see the camera and see if a driver got out and looked when they backed into somebody at a truck stop. It's doing those little things. It's keeping yourself and your brothers and sisters accountable to make sure that we're acting as the professionals we are. And everybody's got the capability of doing that. And, it's also having compassion for people when they do make a mistake. But again, it's holding them accountable and making sure that they get better through those situations.
Absolutely. And guys, I shared at the start that we could make multiple episodes out of this, but I want to share two more points, and then I'm actually going to draw Jim into our conversation. He is our ag OSHA guy, and he's been relatively quiet during this episode, because I know this is almost exclusively a truck deal. But Jim, I promise you're going to see I'm going to make an application to your world here in just a second. But two other things I want to share real quick. Mike and I see this all the time. We are stunned when a motor carrier asks us to help them on a data queue of a crash to determine preventability through the FMCSA, and they don't have a copy of the crash report. I'm sitting there thinking, you've got a $200,000 truck that's been tore up, and you don't want to pay $7 to get a copy of an accident report. What's up with that? That don't make sense. We want to check that crash report because troopers make mistakes. I'm an old trooper. We make mistakes. And some of these truck wrecks are very complex, particularly if they involve multiple trucks. You got 4 or 5 18-wheelers on an icy road and 2 or 3 4-wheelers. That accident report may be 20 pages long because of all the addendums that have been put into it. And so you want to make sure that they've got your truck numbered right. It's going the right direction on the interstate. So get a copy of the crash report and verify that it is accurate. The other thing, we talked about spoliation and evidence. As soon as the wreck occurs, I want to suggest that you immediately preserve at least 30 days of records on your driver. That's the DQ file, the maintenance file on the truck, 30 days of hours of service. And if it looks like it's going to be a serious crash, I would encourage you to go back and run the 6 months of hours of service records, just to have them, and just basically take that, put it in a separate file and leave it. If you don't have to have it during litigation, you can put it right back in the rotation. If you do, you've got it. And again, you don't run the risk of coming under that accusation of spoliation of evidence. And the last thing, and this is where I want to bring Jim in, and Mike, you may want to share something on this too. With our discussion today, most everybody has in mind an 18-wheeler, but we don't need to forget, and because Jim is our agriculture expert, he's our ag guy, and he deals with a lot of clients that may have 3/4 ton, 1 ton trucks. They may haul a load of pesticides out to a field, to a farmer, and end up being hazmat. But these regs can kick in at 10,001 pounds if you're in interstate movement, and that's either a gross vehicle weight rating, a gross combination weight rating if they've got a trailer, or actual gross vehicle weight, how much it weighs. And all of us on here know, every one of us on here are country boys. These 3/4 ton and 1 ton trucks by and primarily the U.S. manufacturers. I'm not seeing this so much on foreign trucks, but the three biggies in the U.S. Of manufacturers of pickups, they're 3/4 and 1 ton trucks. The gross vehicle weight rating on those things get higher and higher every year. Mm-hmm. And you take a 1 ton truck and you put a 30-foot flatbed gooseneck trailer behind it, and you cross the state line, or you're hauling an interstate load, that truck is fully regulated. It is completely under the regulations. The only thing is, driver don't have to have a CDL, but other than that, everything else applies. And so, Jim, I know a lot of your clients, these co-ops, these grain elevators, some of the farm supply places, they've got these mid-sized trucks, these bobtail trucks, and one of them gets involved in a crash. They are as under the stuff we're talking about today as the biggest motor carrier in this nation is. And so my point is, a lot of people listen to the podcast that are followers or clients of yours out of the ag and the OSHA world, but they need to realize this conversation we're having today is applicable to them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been quiet so far because I get to listen to you guys talk about your wheelhouse. But you are correct, and the reporting requirements of the things that they're hauling, it can be extremely small amounts of a reportable spill quality. I'm talking a small cracked tank that you lose a gallon of certain pesticides out of a 300, 500 gallon tank. There are repercussions and steps to be taken, and standoff distances that it all goes into the training. It really does, and it goes into that checklist. You've referenced it many times. The after incident checklist of what do we do, and there's a lot of considerations there. I appreciate you bringing it up, because many of the clients that I have still believe that they're a farmer, or still believe that they are so small, and I'm not driving a tractor. I'm driving a 2500 or a 3500 or a 250, 350, 450, and I'm getting by sneaking these overloads in many cases, going up and down country roads and on these highways, thinking that they don't fall under the regulations. So there's a lot of applicability to that. Mike, anything to add? You and I deal with these folks quite regularly together.
Yeah, I think what you guys have said is so true, and a lot of times it does revolve around those vehicles that are smaller. And what I'm going to do is, and I do this a lot on the podcast, and I know everybody loves reading through regulations, but I'm going to point them back to the regulations and exactly what Kenny said. Go to 390.5 and look at the definition of what a commercial vehicle is. Kenny hit it. When in interstate commerce, if you're at that 10,000 1 pound mark or more, you're regulated. And look and see, okay, is the vehicle I'm operating, if it's a half-ton pickup by itself, maybe not. Is it a 3/4 ton by itself? Maybe. But you could have a 3/4 ton pickup and that gooseneck that Kenny was talking about with two 10,000 pound axles on it, it's got a 20,000 pound GVW. You put those things together, now maybe that driver does need a Class A CDL. And everything applies to them. I mean, you really have to get in and look at the definitions. And I know we're talking about post-crash and what we do post-crash, things like that. But I'm going to pull this back around, and it's important for you guys to know where to find this information and what the definitions are, because, you know, you may or may not have a whole lot of regulatory requirements that apply to you based on the vehicle that you're operating. So it's a great point, Jim, that you're bringing up, that your ag folks know, am I operating a regulated commercial motor vehicle or am I not? Because we just had an accident and I need to know, one, is it a commercial vehicle? Is there some regulations that apply? Two, is it a vehicle that requires a CDL, and now post-accident drug and alcohol testing may apply? So that's really important. It's a great point that you brought up, Kenny. I'm glad you mentioned that with our ag folks, because we do have a lot of great ag folks that we work with that are listening to us. And we want you guys to know, if you're operating a commercial vehicle, and we're going by definition, the same regs apply to you as to our trucking folks that are listening to us out there as well.
You know, guys, we us truck guys, we brag on Jim all the time about being our OSHA guru, and we always learn from him. And I've been impressed with the times Jim has said, hey, y'all taught me something today about trucking that I'm going to share with my ag clients that have trucks. And one thing that I'll go all the way back to what Mike was talking about, that chart out of Part 382. And I know Jim and Barry have been going out together some and calling on ag clients that have trucks, and Jim taking care of the ag and OSHA stuff, and Barry being there and helping with their motor carrier questions. But I would like to encourage any of our ag listeners, and Jim, when y'all are making, you and Barry, when y'all are calling on these ag clients, take them a copy of that chart out of 382, the alcohol and drug testing requirements post-accident, and print off a represented sample of one of those accident checklists, and just sit down with whoever at the co-op, the grain elevator, the farm supply store, whatever it is, and say, hey, if one of y'all's trucks was involved in a crash, who would be the point of contact here at the store that would deal with that driver? And then whoever that person is, share those two items with them. That alcohol and drug test. If their drivers have CDL, they fall under the alcohol and drug testing. If they don't, they don't. But the accident checklist could be invaluable to them, because my guess is those ag clients go long distances worth of time, long periods of time where they don't have a crash. But if they do have one, then it's going to catch them off guard, and that protocol checklist could be very, very valuable to them in that circumstance. All right, Mr. Barry, you started us off with the conversation, and I know it was a little bit of a drama where you pretended to take a call and Mike was your truck driver, but circling back around to that, you know, closing us out with that thought of when that call comes in, what do we do? And knowing that now we're nearing the end of this podcast, how do we wrap all that up?
I think it comes back to, you know, for me, especially just practices and procedures. Run some traps. If you've got to do the call with one of your colleagues or a veteran driver, be practiced on it. Make sure that you know how you're going to react. Have your checklists ready. Have a copy of it on your phone. Have something in your wallet. Just make sure that you've got that there for you if you need that resource. And always remember that we're here to answer any questions for you that may come up during this process. We're here to serve our clients. That's what we enjoy doing day to day. So, you know, make sure you've got our contact information, and above all else, make sure that driver's okay, and follow up with them after the fact to make sure that they're, you know, staying mentally prepared as they should. That being said, thank you all so much for listening to Driving the Line, and we'll see you next time.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, The Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Until the next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.